So like as previous presentation was like, the speaker was forever young, and I'm kind of like how to grow up presentation. That would be some part of my story. And that's like, it'd be more career story than technological one. But, I think for the late evening, some relaxed one is also could be also enjoyed. And, just FYI, this is like, all views are mine. I'm not representing my sponsor of Warsaw.js at these talks, but, So it's like my story was that, I was like, engineering by heart. So, I start coding very early on. In high school, I participate a lot in algorithm competition. I joke that I always was hacking frontend, but I was like quite serious backend developer from C++, Java. And I was lucky, and it will be a story how I was lucky to get some internship, was lucky to have like a broad option of spectrum, picked at some point quite unusual one that didn't look that great, but it ended up being quite successful, and that's what I would like to tell you about. So the motivation when I'm giving you this talk, that I believe Poland is in a very interesting situation. On one hand, we have like so many great engineers. We are creating new frameworks like SQL, things like that. A lot of people work, like if you look how many Polish people work on, I would say, top employees, very decent number, right? If you look how well we are doing in terms of computer science education, great. We are great in algorithm, great in capture the flag competitions. But on the other hand, if you look at the other spectrum, is like, there's like very few product companies based in Warsaw, based in Poland. And I would say in terms of how many engineers we have and how many unicorns, so like these companies that end up being very successful, yes, you could argue CD Projekt Red, you could argue about the others, but I would say very few. So why we have like this big disproportion and why it matters? Maybe having startups is not a big thing, but I argue that it's like a big thing because it gives you free things, right? And yes, I heard taxes, but I would say Sweden got much higher taxes, and they have like Klarna, they have Spotify, so not necessary. I would say we pay less taxes. So I would say startups could give you free things. One of them is power. If you want to be, I would say, rule like a good empire, I would say, like, if you're a politician, in fact, you couldn't do much. You just vote as your leader or your party says. So in fact, being CEO of the company gives you like a huge power, which some people like to rule. I would say for the software engineers also, it gives you freedom. You could do whatever you want. It could also give you money, not in terms, you're not only selling, like hours of your life, you could earn several magnitude times more money. And also you could make like a huge impact, right? Like, it's good to do some community work presentation, but sometimes companies are, I would say, the vehicle of making like the big social change in the fastest way possible. So there are like a three motivations why you may want to start them, and that's why a lot of people join them. And I would say why we have a lot of great engineers, I would say that's partly thanks to the communism, thanks to the system that, wasn't working that great, but, got huge belief in engineers. So, in communism, economy, politician, a lot of things doesn't matter, but it matters to have a lot of good engineers. So you could build the roads, you know how to do that. So thanks to that and good school of mathematics, we have like in Poland quite good strong tradition of engineering. A lot of people want to do that. There is a lot of good schools, a lot of good tutorials. We also have a lot of, I would say, algorithm competitions that also like, helps to educate even more talent. But I would say the underlying message behind all of that is that, if you solve hard problems, very cool technical problems, all things will follow. Which if you work as a software engineer, sometimes that might seem true. You solve hard problems. A lot of companies would like to hire you. But for company building, that's not all, right? And I was, in retrospect, very ingrained with this belief, and I believe a lot of you probably are too. So when I joined university, I was thinking, do the hardest things, algorithm competition, academia, do as many courses at the university as you can, do research. And then, you know, in the second research, I would say in Derry, in Ireland, I reached the cliffs of Moher's physically and also like mentally, that, you know, I learned that in software, it's not that there are some clever academia researchers that invent a new framework and then, you know, everybody else use it. No, it's like every engineer could in their spare time do that. Moreover, like many companies, like, you know, React didn't came from academia. React came from Facebook, right? And pretty much every recent invention in computer science, you much rather trace to, I would say, industry than academia. So I made that realization that, you know, it's not about smartness, it's about joining the industry. So I got the big dream to go to the place where those changes happen. So what was that place in, like, I would say 2009? I would say that was like, you know, Silicon Valley. So thanks to this previous research, I was working on graphic cards using for non-graphical things. I went to internship at NVIDIA, and going to USA was like, it was doable from University of Warsaw, but it wasn't that easy. And after you make all of that hard work, you know, the USA, California was great. But on the other hand, I would say the daily job was, oh, you need to fix these memory leaks, right? I would say maybe JavaScript, you still could leak memory, but in C and C++, it's like a big deal. So you do these basic things. Luckily, I could return to do something more interesting, which was like, you know, if you look, this is like silicon wafer, and this silicon wafer is cut into pieces, and each of these pieces is like, you know, GPU, graphic cards. So that's what like NVIDIA does, like pretty much designs like how this GPU should look like, which is really hard because today it's like a billions of elements. So pretty much, you know, graphic cards even back then were like, you know, almost like writing software, but with like really poor tooling. So you write almost like, you know, very complicated hardware with tooling from early Internet Explorer's days. And on the top of that, you know, it takes about a quarter to compile, right? So imagine that you write like a complex software project, but you just could run this every once per quarter. And that's the world of the hardware, that's why the hardware is really hard, and that's why very few companies manage to do that, because you need so many simulations to make that happen. And back then I was working how to make some software to make some abstraction in CUDA that, you know, the different types of memory are pretty much the same. And even the slowest software development, which is like several times slower than I would say front-end, like, you know, kernel development, was still like so fast to hardware. So that was like interesting research, but the learning was that, you know, if you want to learn, it's better to move, and especially early on in your career, it's better to move like, you know, with things that move on much shorter iterations, because you could learn so much. So, and that was, I would say, my second biggest misprediction of my life, that, you know, I was thinking, okay, why do this hardware is so hard, so slow, things like that, even as the fastest hardware companies. And, you know, at some point, Intel almost annihilated NVIDIA. But then what I missed, the fact that, you know, this NVIDIA could actually end up like a huge thing, thanks to, I would say, first cryptocurrencies and later deep learning. So I could be there, but, you know, I somehow chased the next crazy things, which was Facebook. I would say Facebook in 2011, it was like very famous. There was even like a movie, Social Network, that probably many of you have seen. So maybe you could write in comment if you have seen. I would say if you have seen Social Network movie and enjoy some particular part, I could like either debunk that or like confirm that. Like, you know, I was in Zuckerberg home, so, you know, with that. And Facebook was like completely different style of work. It was more, I would say, this crazy land of hackathons, of like, you know, oh, let's ship like some change to production on like, you know, merge code on the first day, and, you know, ship something to production on first week. Which in 2011, and like company with 1,200 full-time employees, 1,000 interns, that was like crazy thing. And this was like, you know, life-changing, because everything was moving so fast. But on the other hand, everything was exploding. So, you know, on the first day of work, you know, after a very inspiring speech, you go to your manager, and your manager spends 20 minutes with you. Then they get paid with some issue. They run away and forget about you for the next 2 days, right? And, you know, because, you know, they apparently wrote like a chat for few hundred millions of users by 2 people in less than half a year, and it worked, but it was breaking all the time. And that's when they hit the limits of MySQL. So they start to use some proper database. But what happened is that instead of Cassandra didn't work, so they open source, and then they start using much simpler database called HBase. So I end up optimizing some of those. So if any of you ever use chat, I change your data format of your message internal. So thank you. And Facebook was very inspiring because of this fast pace, even in our lands. But what I was thinking at some point that it must be like a bubble. Life at Facebook was so great, so much cash, so much private chefs with cafeteria, things like that. But this company wasn't really making any money back then. And I was thinking, company making like $1 billion in revenue, worth before IPO 80 or $100 billion. That must be a bubble, clearly like a bubble, right? And yes, a lot of early Facebook case back then were just resigning. Why they were resigning? And some people at the dinner table talk, oh, maybe he make $4 million out of his stock. Other 12 million, maybe 8. And people were discussing, but everybody agrees that was somewhere between $4 to $12 million. Because in USA, if you join startups, you not only get your, I would say, monthly salary, but you also get some of the shares. So if your company or option to buy those shares at a really low price. So if your company gets really successful, you could make enormous amount of money. So while saying that, I was thinking, okay, and I make misprediction that Facebook is just a bubble because that seems very natural. They were giving insane offers, but paying in their stock, not just regular dollars. Google was about to launch Google Plus. And what could happen? I make misprediction. Facebook is way bigger than that. But then I talked to those early Facebook case, if that's like a bubble and they're already some of them leaving, how to find the next Facebook. So the answer I get was brutal. Oh, the best and brightest people of the world couldn't reliably predict what will be the next Facebook. So how dare you, cutting out not HR compliant things, developer from Central Eastern Europe could figure out what's the next Facebook. But if you're interested, just follow the smart money. Look, these are I would say 6 top venture capital, so investors who invest in all of those companies. Look where they're investing in early companies and try to find companies that they're invested, and also they, I would say, and you also got some intuition about the business model. So that's how I entered through this Greylock Partners to world of stealth mode startups. So companies that didn't even have proper web page, or the web page were looking oh, we look for Scala hackers and some JavaScript developers. That was the full website. And they were usually very small, less than 20 people. And some of them were making things that I didn't really understand why it may be important, like virtual databases. But the one that hit my buzzwords were was saying that it will work on public cloud, that the cloud is the way how you would run all of this software, which today seems obvious, but I would say in 2011, a lot of people look at cloud, like AWS cloud, as a toy. They will do logs, which I found super important because at Facebook, I couldn't query logs. And querying logs at Facebook scale was harder than writing Linux kernel drivers. Just that's poorly Hadoop, MapReduce jobs back then, that was extremely hard to do. And they were using some cool technologies like Google Web Toolkit for front-end, Scala. So I think all of these smart choices. And indeed, some were smart, some of those technologies didn't turn up that well. So I ended interviewing. They asked me to drop everything and join. I couldn't do that. But then with some drama in between, I finally, around lunchtime, sent them some code showing them actually very motivated to work with them. So they let me in. But that was very weird reputation. First I passed, then they say no, then so, but eventually. And I managed to join Sumo Logic in 2012 when there were about like 20 engineers, 20 employees around the lunchtime when they released their first product. It was like, software as a service, logs. So pretty much sell all of your logs to cloud, and then you could query, do all of the analytics, find all of your bugs in Sumo Logic. I joined as an intern. Later, I moved to USA. And it was like a very interesting ride because this startup, I would say, to some degree, got a great blueprint. It got like great investors. So it was a startup that already got like, a lot of investors early on, professional CEO. It was very well structured. It got, I would say, great. It got all trades, big trends right, that eventually people will use cloud. It figured out that the money is in enterprise sector. And especially those, I would say, early days are super interesting from educational point of view, because you could see the whole company, all the deals, go to lunch with salespeople every week, build a lot of relationships, and pretty much see how the whole thing came to be, which is like really harder later on. And I don't know how many of you work in enterprise startups, but my piece of advice, anytime you do like a tool for developers, there is not much money in selling like, $50 license to some company, because then you are competing with open source and it's really hard. But with developer tooling, all of your money is for the clients that pays you on average, I would say like $70,000 or $80,000 per year, a lot of money. And the goal of these enterprise startups is like to chase those like bigger clients. And it's all about how much you could get those annual recurring revenue. So, what annual recurring revenue is almost like you have some subscription like Netflix, and how much money of that. So usually enterprise startup wants to, at the first year, get at least $1 million in sales, like a few $1 million, and like multiplied by a few times during first few years. And it's like, on quarterly basis. So every quarter there's like either you get few big deals or not. So it's daily life is like very intense because you don't have mature product. All of those enterprise customers want some like custom features, and you need to balance how that you want to build some like generic product, and on the other hand still close deals. And there's a lot of, I would say, situations when you're like very close to be on the top of the world because you close one or two big customers, or you could miss someone because of some very simple mistake on things like that. And in hindsight, also, I would say every big company that got usually big potential, initially they look very flawed. So, for example, like, how many, I think quite a few people may have watched like Silicon Valley sitcom. And in the first series, there was like this whole argument about the box thing. So actually one of the early employees of Sumo Logic was consultant on this HBO show. And this whole discussion where all of the engineers were believer in software as a service, release as frequent as you want, don't maintain a legacy version, things like that. All of the sales people from like, traditional Boston area, they were like, oh, you need to be able to download and install it in someone data center. Why is this cloud? So there was like a never-ending argument of this sort. And to some degree, we were, I would say, too early, a little bit too early with the cloud thing that, everything will go to cloud. But eventually, at some point, it was obvious, and so many people started moving to cloud because they don't want to manage, I would say, system, like especially log system. It's kind of like, emergency system. So it often got like a spike of data, spike of usage, and you want to work it really reliable during those critical periods when all of those installed software usually break in this worst moment. So from having something that looked initially as like, why would anybody trust to send data to you, eventually it started looking really good. And that, as with every startup, you need to know like that kind of flow is almost like playing poker and know who is the sucker on the table. But what the biggest change was like, the life could move on. And probably that would be story as many others. But at some point of my life, I with my wife decided that it's like a point of returning from California. It's maybe not the best. It's a good place for the journey, but not for the settling down there. I got a really good reputation back then. I shipped a lot of software, but eventually returning. So the founders really work hard to keep me at the company. But working remotely with California is like really hard. It's like a 9-hour time difference. It's really hard to work in those short iterations. So I returned from California and was like fairly clueless, and that's how I looked like. That's my picture. But that triggered like some mindset switch that I could no longer be this person that I would just tell like, oh, I will code you as many widgets as you want. I need to do something that our CEO would appreciate, that, I need to figure out how to solve some important problem that will change the life of the company. And there was a lot of chaos, a lot of jungle. It was mostly like, I would say, organic rather than like having a big plan. But what I figured out, what was the biggest problem I knew, that, we were wasting so much money on this public cloud. Because the original people that you hire at Sumo were great prototypers, that they could build a lot of stuff quickly, but they weren't that interested in optimizing efficiency. So, and at some point, those investors which funded us asked questions of when are you going to start making money? And it turned out that we primarily spend money that we earn from the customers on AWS. And that wasn't really like a sustainable way. So, and actually in Poland, there's a lot of, I would say, people that study algorithms, that like those optimization struggles. I got some idea how to solve that. And that's like, I would say why I picked those ideas, that was methodological. So I was thinking that, that was like very easy to justify. Like, if you show some graph and you show that you'll be 2 times more efficient, anybody will buy that argument. And what I work on is, instead of having like one clever idea how to optimize, and there were like some people wanting to have that, instead of like very methodological look, what's the probability of this idea of succeeding, how costly it is, how much money is going to save, pretty much having like very systematical way. I managed to get some initial success for a month or 2. And then eventually like people ask me, okay, what do you need to make this successful for next 10 months? And I say like, hire a few people. So I ended up like hiring a few people, and then I haven't really planned it, but I ended like being more manager than I would say engineer at some point. So I started hiring quite a lot of people, initially very slow, later like more. And that's where I would say the career paths completely change, because as engineer, you need to work out details and all of the things. But as a manager, I would say the best way to be successful is to hire like great talent. Okay, there's like one question: what means the idea is valid? I would say you could do some proof of concept. You could look at AWS build. You could do some prototype and see if in some testing environment this would work or not. So that's the question, whether the idea is valid. But maybe that was about cost. Maybe I'll answer about the company later on. And as a manager, what you need also to do is like make sure that the team setup is really good. So you know what people are working on, what is their idea, how do you measure how productive they are, or things like that. And also like communication is like super important, both how you train people, how you onboard them locally in Poland, and also how well you could communicate across to people in different offices. And this proved approach successful, but anytime if you work in your career, you know that there is so much you can do if you just save money or do some infra. Eventually, if you want to be more successful in the company, you need to start making some money, right? In every company, usually if you make money, it's more important than saving money. But the problem with creating product, it's quite complex. You not only could rely on having few backend people, you also need to hire, I would say, front-end people. You also need to have good relation with product managers, UX, hire them or work with someone. And that's quite hard. And we started, I would say, 2 years later to work on one of the projects like Metrics. which after some very windy road eventually start working and selling. But that was like much harder. But on the other hand, that like grown up Office by a lot. Today, people primarily work on this product, not just on not only on infra. And that way we build like one product called Metrics, and later second product called Tracing. And that's pretty much, I would say, and that's with all of those products and the company growing during that time, Sumo Logic, even though I would say 2020 was a very, I would say, weird year in terms of COVID, economical crisis, things like that, we still managed to IPO pretty much from a parking lot outside of in California with over 2 billion valuation and 70 engineers in Poland, which is like 70 employees out of 300 in product development team worldwide, and we are still growing. So maybe what I would like to like think for you, and that's like the advice that usually it's good to think about your career and like what do you want to do and like make conscious choices. And sometimes I would say the best place to start is like, you know, where you could learn the most, and also like pick some place that's like quite successful. I would say this in middle that, you know, it's already, you feel some convictions that will be successful, but you don't take the full risk, and you could, I would say, sometimes learn the most if you join something that's going well and you could contribute that. But even if you do usually the road would be windy. There is a lot of mistakes, a lot of things that didn't come as planned. So I would say the persistence and the fact that you could execute and continue to always be executing is like a key. And also I should tell you with all of those, I would say, successful speeches on, there should be, I would say, disclaimer from survivor bias. So like never stop buying lottery tickets, no matter what anyone tells you. And you could judge if my presentation got some merit or it's about buying lottery tickets. But in fact, nah. Survivor bias is like a thing, because out of those 5 companies I was interviewing, only Sumo Logic was successful. So maybe my intuition was right, or maybe I was lucky, but that's it. And thank you for hosting me here, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Congratulations, Jacek. Amazing presentation, and it's all fact-based. 70 out of 200
300.
Poland, right?
So out of 300, yeah.
Out of 300. And does it also convert to shares? Also this kind of part of this great success of Sumo?
So I would say shares will be fairly proportional, but you know, the number of shares allocated to employees is like around like 10 to 15%. So, you know, you could do the math.
Wow. So, wow. Jacek, so that's absolutely amazing. Thanks. What do you think? Is it better to be good at one particular technology, or to be more flexible, but not a specialist in any of them? I think it is difficult to combine the two without breaking the work-life balance.
So I would tell, like, you know, at the earlier stage you are, it pays more to be flexible. So if you join like a startup, the fact that you can do anything, that's like your key advantage. The later you go in company life, usually being more specialist pays off, because by the time you have like several front-end people, it makes like a nice stand to be able to do some UI, but it's like more like a stand than like a real value. So I would say be specialist later on. So it depends what are you shooting for. I would say early companies, I would say being generalist pays off. And with the work-life balance is like, you know, I would say it's quite hard sometimes, like at the early stage, to have like a great work-life balance, but it's very important not to burn out, because I've seen cases that, you know, people burn out early on in their life, and it's very hard to recover from that.